Bien, bonsoir mesdames et messieurs. Je ne sais pas si le micro fonctionne. Ça a l'air d'être le cas. On commence avec un tout petit peu de retard parce qu'il semblerait que la ville soit un peu bloquée par une manifestation, mais d'autres personnes vont sans doute nous rejoindre, mais on va commencer. Je m'appelle Francesco Panese, j'ai le grand plaisir de siéger depuis assez longtemps dans le jury du Prix Européen de l'essai, et c'est moi qui vais animer, ou plutôt modérer, la discussion de ce soir. Mais avant tout, j'aimerais redonner la scène au propriétaire des lieux pour un accueil, le directeur du Théâtre de Vidy, Vincent Baudriller.
Donc, bonsoir à toutes et à tous. Et donc, petite précision, je ne suis pas le propriétaire des lieux, mais j'essaie d'assumer au mieux la responsabilité de la direction de ce théâtre. Dear Dipesh Chakrabarty, cher Cyril Veillon, cher membre de la Fondation Charles Veillon, chers représentants et représentantes de l'UNIL, chers amis, bienvenue au Théâtre de Vidy. Notre théâtre est heureux et fier d'accueillir la table ronde du Prix Européen de l'essai avec vous, Dipesh Chakrabarty, organisé par la Fondation Charles Veillon et par l'Université de Lausanne. Le titre de votre essai, « Après le changement climatique, penser l'histoire », résonne avec les préoccupations de nombre d'artistes invités à créer ici, dans ce théâtre. Avec l'UNIL, nous avons d'ailleurs développé depuis 5 ans un cycle intitulé « Imaginaire des futurs possibles », où artistes et chercheuses et chercheurs étaient invités à produire de nouveaux imaginaires pour le futur. Ils et elles étaient accompagnés par le philosophe Dominique Bourg, puis par la penseuse Vinciane Després, et enfin par le chorégraphe congolais de Kisangani, Faustin Lignécoula, afin de relier les questions écologiques aux questions décoloniales. Cette même préoccupation d'une écologie décoloniale sera au centre du travail de l'artiste sud-africaine Ntando Tsele, qui répète en ce moment à Vidy « Wasted Land », qui ouvrira la saison du 20 au 29 septembre. On retrouvera ce sujet d'ailleurs dans le spectacle Écosystème du groupe suisse et congolais 50-50 en novembre. Ce qui veut dire que votre discussion de cet après-midi, Francesco, sera une magnifique introduction à notre saison et je vous en remercie.
Merci beaucoup Vincent Baudriller. Maintenant, j'ai le plaisir de donner la parole à Cyril Veillon, le président de la Fondation Charles Veillon.
Merci Francesco. Voilà, à moi maintenant de vous accueillir et surtout de vous dire merci. Merci beaucoup Vincent et les équipes, l'équipe du Théâtre de Vidy de nous recevoir dans cette belle maison pour recevoir notre lauréat du 46e Prix Européen de l'essai. Donc un prix de l'essai s'inscrit dans un débat d'idées. D'ailleurs, notre slogan, notre motto, c'est le mouvement de la pensée. Quoi de mieux qu'un théâtre qui, comme Vincent, ce que tu as évoqué tout à l'heure, votre saison, quoi de mieux qu'un théâtre qui vraiment met littéralement en mouvement la pensée et la création pour venir débattre des thèses et des idées de nos lauréats. C'est la deuxième fois qu'on a le plaisir de se retrouver ici et on est particulièrement bien chez vous. Merci beaucoup aussi à l'Université de Lausanne, l'UNIL, notre partenaire de longue date maintenant, grâce à qui on peut organiser des discussions mémorables avec nos lauréats et les professeurs de l'université. Merci beaucoup Francesco Panese d'organiser tout ça brillamment avec nous et avec l'institution de l'université. Merci aux professeurs Rahel, Kunz, Valérie Boisvert et Söderström qui ont préparé des questions et ce débat avec Dipesh Chakrabarty. Le débat aura lieu en anglais. Nous avons la chance de pouvoir compter sur la traduction simultanée faite avec, je crois que je peux le dire, avec passion par Loman Lefort. Merci beaucoup Loman d'avoir accepté ce défi de traduire cette discussion et puis Loman traduira aussi la discussion qui aura lieu demain à 11h au Livre sur les quais, ce sera au Casino. Une discussion que Dipesh Chakrabarty aura avec l'auteur Dominique Bourg. Voilà, donc c'est le prochain rendez-vous de cette série d'événements avec notre lauréat. Et si vous voulez réécouter le discours que Dipesh Chakrabarty a prononcé lorsqu'il a reçu le prix, c'est possible de le suivre en ligne. Vous pouvez le voir, vous trouvez tout sur notre site. On communique aussi sur Instagram nos activités les événements autour du prix de l'essai et d'autres activités qu'on a au cours de l'année pour la promotion, la diffusion de l'essai, notamment des cercles, des clubs de lecture. Donc, merci de suivre nos activités, de partager avec nous tous ces débats et ces discussions. Maintenant, place à la discussion. Francesco, merci beaucoup de diriger le maître de cérémonie ce soir. Je te repasse la parole. Merci.
Merci beaucoup, Cyril. Alors, on va. Merci beaucoup, Cyril. Donc, sans attendre, je vous propose d'accueillir le lauréat 2024 du Prix européen de l'essai Charles Veillon, M. Dipesh Chakrabarty. Dipesh Chakrabarty s'installe et Dipesh Chakrabarty va dialoguer avec des collègues. Tout d'abord, Valérie Boisvert. Valérie Boisvert est économiste de l'environnement et des ressources naturelles à notre Institut de géographie et de durabilité de l'Université de Lausanne. Bienvenue Valérie. Rahel Kunz. Rahel Kunz est politiste, spécialiste de la gouvernance des migrations internationales, des questions de genre dans les migrations et le développement. Bienvenue Rahel. Et Ola Söderström, géographe en géographie sociale et culturelle, spécialiste des développements urbains en lien avec la mondialisation qui nous vient de l'université de Neuchâtel, pas très loin. Merci Ola d'être là. Alors, nous allons dialoguer d'abord sur la scène et ensuite, évidemment, le public aura la possibilité de dialoguer aussi et de poser des questions. J'ai même mis une minuterie pour garder le temps. So let's switch now in English. So in my bad English, dear Dipesh, we are really happy, of course, to having you here. And we would like to start with a kind of topical question. You published your book in 2021, so it was almost yesterday, comparing to the longue durée you discuss in your book. But but you are a historian, but you are an historian of the present. The question you address are the question of the present. So the first topical question we would like to ask to you, just to introduce this discussion, is what are the main situations or events in the last years, I mean the last few years, that echoes or resonate with your work?
Thank you for the question. Thank you to everybody who's here. And first of all, I have to say, before I answer the question, that I'm extremely honored to be here, to be in conversation with my colleagues here, and to be in that conversation in your presence. So I have to acknowledge that sense of being honored, which always humbles you. To go back to your question, so 2021, the English language book came out, and even if you look at the dedication of the French edition, it is actually dedicated to the humans and the non-humans who lost their lives in two places close to my heart because of in the Bengal Delta, Bangladesh and West Bengal, and I'm from the city of Calcutta in West Bengal. People who lost their lives because of the cyclone called the Amphan cyclone. And people who lost their lives because of the 2021 firestorms in Australia, when actually there was a map of Australia produced which looked like the whole country was burning. And, after I left India, Australia was the first country I lived in for 20 years. I did my PhD there. I taught there for 10 years. My son still lives there. So in many ways, it's also a part of the world that's very close. And both India, the subcontinent, and Australia, because of their geographical situation, India because of this huge peninsula part and the glaciers in the Himalayas, Australia because of where the country is, they're both very exposed to the danger of climate change. But since then, if you ask me about what are the events that stand out for me, first of all are the two wars. Because see, climate change, mitigating climate change, adapting to climate change, doing something about climate change is actually an argument for peace. The military emissions, the military of the world and the American military being the foremost of them, are a huge emitter of greenhouse gases. During the Kyoto Protocol, there was a proposal to make it compulsory for every military force to calculate and make public their emissions. The Americans, being the most powerful military, made it optional. But there are reports actually coming out of England where people have already made calculations of the greenhouse gas emissions from just the first 2 months of the Gaza war. And it is like the emission of a small nation. And of course, the more you have wars, the more, if you just have to look at the per capita consumption of oil in the American military from the Second World War through the Vietnam War to now, and it's gone up enormously. So those ongoing events, they're not even concluded events. So I think about the technology of war, the war, and particularly as a realistic humanist historian, assuming that humans will never probably, unfortunately, stop fighting. But we're faced with a crisis that actually calls for peace. So there have been very interesting, somewhat ironical discussions in the military circles about green missiles. I don't know what they mean. But greening of military forces, it is under discussion, but the problem with military is that weapons are very expensive. Once you buy a fighter airplane, you have to use it for some time to get the value out of it. So it commits you, it locks you into certain kind of expenditure pattern. So the two wars are terrible. And the heat waves and other kinds of disasters, but particularly heat waves, both in Europe. Last year I was caught in the heat wave, both in, I was visiting, my wife and I were visiting Palermo in Sicily, and we were right in the middle of a heat wave. And then I went to France the next month to an environmental festival, and again there was a huge heat wave going on, when the United Nations secretary kept saying that it's no longer a climate crisis, it's a climate emergency. And the third thing that affects my thinking is the fact that in America, at least in my university, Stanford University, many other places, the question of climate change and dealing with climate change is being treated as a question of technology and the marketplace. And therefore, there's an enormous amount of research money going into carbon capture and sequestration, battery technology, and geoengineering. So we actually have somebody, a well-known physicist who came from Harvard, who is doing one of those experimental things about spreading aerosol particles in the stratosphere to reflect sunlight back. And these are, in connection with that, I think that's the tendency to not to take a holistic view of the crisis, which has to do with things we'll talk about, like biodiversity, urban management, climate. The peace is already an international relations argument, but to reduce it to the question of just purely this, carbon capture and geoengineering, in order to, as some of them say, to buy humanity more time to transition to renewables has resulted, I mean, the impact was very clear in the last COP in Doha, COP28, when the oil companies hosted the COP discussion and actually presented the argument that if you can capture greenhouse gases and bury them underground, then we are not the problem. We are part of the solution. You can go on using as much oil and gas as you want because you're taking care of the problem. So these are powerful forces in the world talking about this. Bill Gates' book, How to Avert a Climate Disaster, which came out again in 21-22, pretty much argues for this scenario. I think this kind of thinking, I'm not saying we shouldn't do this. I agree with Paul Crutzen and others who said it is getting so desperate that we should probably have a mix of strategies. But to reduce climate change, the planetary crisis, to just an energy question and a temperature question, because all they're aiming to do is to bring the temperature down so that we can continue with this lifestyle for longer, which may in effect be a strategy of passing on the real cost to future generations. So, but that debate is not being had. Or it's almost impossible to have that debate in my same university with my economist friends who are driving this, and they would tell me, Dipesh, we agree on the problem, we just land in different places. So that's the other thing that I noticed, the change since I wrote this book. And the last thing I want to say is that we are still not aware enough of our relationship to the non-human. And the non-human includes the non-human, non-living things like non-living in a relative sense, like mountains and rivers. And the non-human living things where the majority forms of life, beyond human form of life, are microbial. And the pandemic is an object lesson. The pandemic was an object lesson in the fact that we live with microbes inside us. We live with microbes outside us. Microbes have had a very interesting role to play in the history of life. The coronavirus, because it had lived in probably the guts of a bat. Bats have been around for 50 million years, while Homo sapiens have been around for 300,000 years. So in many ways, as Anthony Fauci and others were saying, that the coronavirus was already kind of pre-organized, pre-adapted to mammalian cells. And the destruction of forests, as Anthony Fauci and others were saying, both in academic writings during the pandemic and in their public speeches, that the destruction of forests has a major role to play in forcing wild animals come close to us. Because wild animals don't seek us out. It's only when we destroy their habitat that they come close to us. Mumbai is expanding in such a way. It's expanding in a territory that belongs to leopards and other wild animals. And they are being forced to be urban, to come back to the question of cities. So here is the thing. It is from 2007 that more than half of human beings have begun to live in cities. And the rate is going up of urbanization. The prediction is that by the end of this century, we will be mainly an urban dwelling species. And this is the process because of the expansion of cities, which are also forcing some wildlife to become urban, like foxes in Berlin, here, wild boar in Berlin. And just watching television shots of the Gaza war and of the upheaval in Bangladesh, I've only seen two shots in which it wasn't the photographer's intention, but they caught a dog running away from the sound of explosion. So of course humans are suffering, but we don't. But now there's worries about polio. So we are actually creating a situation in which the microbial environment changes. Things happen through these wars. So what makes me a little, what can I say, sorry or realistic about this talk about this being only a problem of carbon capture and then geoengineering, is that we do not seem to have learned enough from 3 years of the pandemic. And for people like myself, Amitav Ghosh, the Indian writer, you had Arundhati Roy, I don't know about her experience, but I know about Amitav's experience. See, our lives have become global over the last 20, 30, 50 years. And you now have a global little middle class like myself, where people depend on being able to fly, which is not a good thing. But our emotions are now dispersed. You know, parents are here, children are somewhere else. As I said, my son lives in Australia. And during the pandemic, my sister died. But we were all stuck. We couldn't go. I couldn't see her. Amitav Ghosh, the writer's mother, died. And he couldn't go. So in many ways, I often say jokingly that, look, some people become global in situ. If you're an American, you don't have to go somewhere else to be global because the globe comes to you. The Dipesh comes and Amitav Ghosh comes, right? You suddenly find you are global. People have come to work, people have come to provide service. But for people like ourselves, the third world, the upcoming nations, the emerging nations, middle classes, we have increasingly come to the West because from the 60s on, to the West's population has been aging, and they have needed labor, skilled labor, relatively less skilled labor. And on the one hand, this raises the question of migration and the fear of migration, questions of racism, but it also has implications for our lives. And the pandemic was a different experience for people like us, and now, because Fauci said we live in an era of pandemics because of the destruction of the forests. In one scientific piece I read that if we destroy about 25% of the canopy of the forest, we are in serious trouble. And the figure they gave was that we are at 17% of destruction. So there's a lot to talk about it, but those are some of the major events that have had me thinking.
So thank you, Dipesh. And so you just mentioned the interest you have, of course, for the living of human and non-human. And you are not only an historian, you are also a philosopher. And a philosopher built a fashion concept. And one concept is really central in your work, I guess, or we guess, it's habitability. So if you agree, we would like to move on this really key concept of habitability in your work. Please, Ola.
Yes, thank you. I think what we'll try to do together here is to also see how you take a holistic view to the problems you've been talking about, and how we should try not to run away from the problems in solutions like geoengineering. I need to say something first before I come to habitability. Thank you. So thank you for your work. Because your work has been living with me. I've been thinking through your work. I've been writing and teaching through your work. And it's been like sticking to me, sticking with me in some ways, whereas many other books just glide away. So thanks a lot for your important and sticky books. What I would like to do, but I think is important, especially for those of us who haven't read, well, those of you I have read the book, is to get to this question, the kind of central question. In your book, you make a central distinction between the globe and the planet, a distinction which is very familiar for us in geography. I'm a geographer. And you suggest that we make a switch that is correlated to this distinction, and I'll let you then explain what you mean by this distinction between a human-centered idea of sustainability to a planet-centered idea of habitability, so where the non-humans come in. And what you're saying, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that to make that switch, we need to regain a sense of wonderment and reverence for the planet we inhabit. So to the question that we are all asking ourselves, we were talking about this before, what should we do now? You seem to respond that we need a cultural change. The priority is a cultural change. So my question is twofold. The first is to explain perhaps to the audience the importance of this distinction you make, and these two distinctions between the globe on the one hand, the planet on the other, sustainability and habitability, and how you see the responses that we should be giving to the problems we are facing, the Gaia that we are facing.
Thank you. I agree with you. It is a sticky book because it was sticky for myself. I mean, I had to work out a lot of things for myself, and here was the problem. Why the question of the planet, and I'll explain what I mean by planet, became important for me. Because when I first started to think about, or let me take a step back and go back to Francesco, your description of me as a philosopher, not just a historian but a philosopher, but I guess in a manner of thinking, I am a philosopher of history in that sense. Yeah, I mean, in the sense that, see, if you grow up in a place like India or China after independence, and I was born a year after independence, it was very hard to avoid questions of progress, development, growing out of poverty, economic growth, what to do with inequality, what to do with caste, what to do with gender. I mean, those were the questions that made up our universe of thinking. And of course, we were influenced by MIT economists like Rostow and later Robert Solow. And the Soviet Union and the US were kind of models of modernization. See, Europe, having created and fought 2 wars, you can see, I mean, Europe has become much more pacifist than the Americans, who really haven't paid as much price for wars, making wars, as Europeans have. And therefore, at a huge cost to themselves, the European learned the value of peace. In fact, a friend of mine, Stella Garvas, who now teaches in UCLA but really used to be in Geneva and wants to be back, maybe back, has a wonderful book on the history of peace in Europe, where she uses the expression conquering peace. In other words, to know that peace is something you earn, and it's fragile. Americans have not taken that in yet, because apart from the Civil War, they really haven't seen now a devastating war. The indigenous people have, but the settler colonial people haven't. And they've actually increasingly invested in technology where you don't have to fight your neighbors. You fight people you haven't even met properly and destroy their lives. And that, I came to the problem with that, and I realized as I was reading about climate change that 2 Indian activists, Anil Agarwal and Sunita Narayan, who set up a Center for Science and Environment in Delhi in the 1980s, were present at the Rio conference of 1991, and they were the first people who said, and it made a distinction to the Kyoto Protocol, that you can't simply talk about emissions, and they were actually arguing against what the World Resources Institute was arguing, saying that you can't blame all of humanity, you calculate it per capita. And then you see that you can't morally compare the emissions of a Vietnamese peasant to the luxury emissions from OECD countries or more developed countries. And that argument completely makes sense to me, made sense then, and it stays with me. But the problem was that when you read about biodiversity, the more you read into this science, you realize that we are damaging different things on different scales, and these different things don't all come back over the same time. Some are much slower to come back. So when I was reading this book written by an oceanographer and atmospheric chemist called How to Make a Habitable Planet, they were asking a question which astrobiologists ask is, what makes a planet suitable for life? Why are we the only Goldilocks planet that's suitable for life? And then I realized that for planetary scientists, Earth system scientists, their problem is not sustainability of human societies or institutions. Their problem is what they this question, what makes a planet habitable? There's no definite answer yet, because the sample size is 1, this planet. But they make interesting scientific extrapolations from this. But what thing has become very clear, that on this planet, geological and biological processes have interacted for very long period, billions of years, in order to prepare this planet for life. Biodiversity means that each form of life, the human form of life, depends on there being other forms of life. The fact that most life forms are microbial means that we've now discovered the microbiome. We know that there are zillions of bacteria inside and us, which actually means that the model that you have an organism and its environment outside has broken down. Our environment is also inside, right? And therefore, and they make this proposition. They said if you destroy the soil of a planet, see, on the moon, you don't get soil, you get moon dust. Because soil has life in it that works on keeping the soil. Soil takes 10 to 15 years, 1,000 years to come back properly. And they said biodiversity can take millions of years to come back. So if you destroy biodiversity, and this I go back with the problem with this thinking of climate change simply as a problem of energy transition and temperature. Climate change is a deep problem of biodiversity, the loss of biodiversity. And the question is not a simple one, but this is what made me realize that the planet has a life support system that has supported life for billions of years and complex life for at least 500 million years. That process includes the supply of oxygen to the atmosphere by phytoplanktons and other creatures on which we depend. So we come towards the very end of this life of the planet. Some people say if you consider the age of the planet to be 100, then Homo sapiens turn up when the planet is 80. So even the oxygen in the air was not necessarily made with us in mind. And that made me realize that the human condition has changed. The things which helped me to think about history of imperialism, colonialism, which is what, let's say, my friends Anil Agarwal and Sunita Narayan were thinking about. They were thinking through the history of colonialism to say do per capita emissions, and that's totally right. But actually the damage is being done on such a big scale that we have to expand our vision of history. And that's what gave rise to it. That's when I began to read into biology, into geology, to say that we have to look at ourselves from 2 perspectives. One is the globe, which is a human-made construction. The globe as a connected sphere where we can travel from one part of this sphere to another has been produced over 500 years through European expansion, imperialism, rise of capitalism, history of technology, very important things. And our politics, most of the politics we still do is really premised on the global. But the planetary is inviting us to take a perspective on ourselves of a much longer term. So I say that the globe was made by humans. It is by definition a humanocentric perspective. This life-supporting system was not made by humans. We can destroy it. We can't create it. And that is a perspective which decenters us. Mm-hmm. And I said that's why it made me think that this is why we have Planetary Age in the English title, that we are, as a historian, you name the age, it's Moyen Age or it's sort of modern age or whatever, and I said we are on the cusp of global and the planetary age. But the crisis has become visible. I can, as a humanist historian, why was I reading biology? Why was I reading geology? Because they were telling me how deeper and how widespread the crisis is. But it is, if you look at the statistics, it's really the exponential rise in human flourishing. And I'll say that again, from the 19th century on. So I'll just give you very quickly some statistics. So if we are 300,000 years old, it took us almost 300,000 years to reach the number 1 billion human. So humans were 1.6 billion at 1900. At the end of the 20th century, we are 6 billion. So just 1.6 to 6. And now going on to 9. At 8, going on to 9. And it has come down, but it has gone up like exponentially from 1950 on. If you look at humans as consumers of gadgets. So again, it was only in 1986 that you had 1 billion humans who could be counted as consumers of fridge, television, etc. Today we are about between 3 or 4 billion humans who consume. And there are two interesting things about it. One is that in 2000, most of the consumers of consumer goods were in the developed countries, OECD countries and Japan and developed countries. Today, the developed countries constitute about 35% of the consuming classes. The rest come from China, India, middle classes in Africa, Latin America, elsewhere. In between 2000, I was sharing this other day, Václav Smil, a Canadian scientist and historian of modernity, has a very interesting book that came out a few years ago called How the World Really Works. And he shows somewhere that in 2 years, this century, 2017 to 19 perhaps, if I'm not mistaken, China produced and consumed as much cement as the United States produced all over the 20th century. A physicist friend of mine, on hearing me say this, he watched the award ceremony, he wrote to me saying, I was in Shanghai 10 years ago, and I have never seen such a collection of cranes building. And people told him that China has more cranes than the rest of the planet taken together. And he says, look, that's at least one data in support of what you're saying. So it is, what I say in the book, that it is the intensification of globalization, the economy, that produces this crisis, which suddenly for somebody like me makes the planetary dimension visible. I mean, otherwise, of course, people have been talking about, at least since the discovery of the hole in the ozone layer in the 1980s, they've been talking about climate change, right? But I was thinking of this in this century. But that's my argument, that the planetary perspective is not unconnected to the global perspectives, but it's an intensification. So let me quickly say this. The question I was trying not to address in the book is what is to be done. Yes. So this is not a Leninist what is to be done book. I was trying to be calm in the middle of an emergency. It's like the house was on fire. And Patrice Méliès said the other day, Dipesh is like the prince in Dostoevsky's Idiot, asking, but what is the problem? Right? See, because the very rhetoric of emergency rushes your thinking. And that's why I was trying to resist it and saying, let me take a measure of the problem as a predicament. And I have another short book came out last year in English called One Planet, Many Worlds, The Climate Paradox. It's coming out next month from CNRS in Paris in French. And I try to deal more with the question of what is to be done.
We might get back to that point. Maybe another question before I pass the word to the others. I think also to explain the way you look at these things. So you were talking about the very long times of the creation of life on Earth. But there's also another time frame which is very important for you, is the time frame of colonization and the legacy of colonization. And there's a strong connection in your intellectual trajectory between the post-colonial questions, what happened after the colonial period, and which has continued in many ways, and the question of climate change and biodiversity. And I think there are two arguments in your book, if I get you right, or at least it's the way I see it. One is that, of course, there's a connection between we need to consider that the colonial legacy is also a legacy that has a strong impact on issues of environmental justice, because basically the colonized countries were the ones that made the wealth of Europe, and now they carry the brunt of the climate change. The other question maybe, or the other aspect I think which is maybe less straightforward and probably interesting to explain to the audience, is what you call, or Césaire, I think, calls the unfulfilled promises of modernity and progress. So today, globalization. So the idea that with colonization came the promise that never really happened in countries of the global south, in many of them. And the question is that modernity still has a strong appeal. You were talking about the cranes in China. So the idea that we're going to get there at some point plays a very important role in how we can address the question of habitability today. So could you maybe elaborate a bit on that question, especially on this?
Sure, and then, I mean, thank you for asking that question about what is the place of colonization in my thinking?
Yeah.
Well, that's where, again, as I was arguing and trying to explain the other day, so when you look at European expansion, and then you see there are two kinds of colonization that happens. Let's say colonization and domination. Where the European ones land, getting out, they willy-nilly, either through imported diseases or through their own activities, destroy indigenous population demographically, culturally, institutionally. The reservations are created. They're moved from where they live, and you have a certain kind of what my friend Patrick Wolf, who's sadly dead now, used to call a genocidal logic to a certain kind of colonization, and that's the story of settler colonial countries, roughly. I mean, I'm putting it crudely because when you look at it up close, there are tensions between, let's say, in Australia, between missionaries and administrators. You know, so there are sometimes people who want to take pastoral care of these people in reservations, and administrators or settlers who just look on them as vermin. But it's like, and there again, there's a differences between what happens in New Zealand, what happens in Australia, what happens in Canada, what happens in the United States. The very history of treaty making with these people is very different. Australia was without treaty. America has treaties. New Zealand has Waitangi Treaty. And whereas in our case, because we're already too many in number and we have things that Europeans think are marks of civilization, written language, buildings, you know, all these things that the Muslims built and the Hindus built. And of course, if you look at European discovery of Hinduism, I mean, the influence of Buddhism, for instance, on German idealism, and particularly philosophical thought, is deep. And the discovery of Sanskrit as an ancient language. So what you get is this other kind of Orientalist scholarship, and that gets mixed in with their educational policies to set up universities. The Australian universities and Indian universities are set up in the same year. And I'm very much a product of the middle class that is produced out of this interaction. So instead of life forms being destroyed, actually you have other kinds of developments. One of the Bengali poets in the early 19th century taught himself Italian so that he could read Dante in the original, and introduced the Petrarchan sonnet in my language, and read Milton to introduce blank verse. So it's a very different kind of story, and I think post-colonialism comes out of more this kind of experience, whereas the decolonial talk today comes out of the other kind of the settler colonial experience. And there are of course, you know, echoes and resonances. Otherwise, why would somebody sitting in India read Frantz Fanon? But at the same time, I was quoting Césaire, and we all share this this experience that the Europeans come and say that we will, even with Aboriginal people, they said we'll put you through education, make you civilized. But even today, the rate of Aboriginal deaths in custody in Australia is much higher than, so there are structural asymmetries and inequalities flowing out of the settler colonial condition. Whereas now, on the flip side, you see what happens in India and China. These are two huge countries that come out of histories of famines. So from the very beginning, both Mao and Nehru are interested in how to grow agricultural output, feed people. That's what leads to an interest in dams. So the Tennessee Valley Corporation becomes a model. Similarly, later on, the Norman Blau's work on high-yielding variety of wheat and eventually high-yielding variety of rice, the Green Revolution. These come out of this aspiration to feed people, this sense of development. MIT economist Rostow writes Stages of Economic Growth. So this growth ideology becomes the predominant ideology in these countries, both with Deng Xiaoping opening up with 4 modernizations after Mao's death, and with Manmohan Singh, who was later the Prime Minister, but who was the Finance Minister in 1991, opening up Indian economy. And this coincided with the kind of reforms that Ronald Reagan and Maggie Thatcher were doing to their economies. And I was only listening this morning to an extremely interesting lecture on YouTube by my friend Abhijit Banerjee at MIT, who's also a Nobel-winning economist. The talk was called The Future of Inequality. And he was talking about the problem of enormous inequalities growing in the world as the world has grown, wealth-wise, as more people have become wealthy. But the inequality has grown. And he was saying that the income of the top 1,000 people in the world, richest people, is more by 2 or 3 folds, or even maybe larger, than the rest of the 1% rich people of the global population. So if you think of 1% of very rich people, within them among them there are 1,000. So you're saying Elon Musk has so much wealth he can't spend it. He literally says even if he buys a Ferrari every month, it won't be enough for his outlet, and he has to think of going to the moon. Because that's the kind of expensive projects. And he also said something very interesting. He said when you have that kind of money, 1,000 people with that kind of money, all the companies that actually cater to them, like produces branded products, very expensive branded products, all these companies become profitable just servicing this niche market. But it actually sets up kind of a revolution of aspiration. And I'll just say this and finish this answer, this part of the answer. So there was an interview done in this century, like around 2012, if I'm not mistaken, by some Norwegian anthropologist in India, asking a peasant woman, young peasant woman of 20, not yet married, if she wanted her daughter to move to the city and be in the city. And she said, yes, of course. And they said, why? She gave 3 reasons, if I can remember them, but I found it fascinating. She said, A, in the city, you can cook standing up. That's because if you go to the village hearths in India, the actual hearth, the mud, the clay stove oven is on the ground. And women have to squat while cooking and then get up and bring something again, squat. And she said, but in the city, I can stand up and cook. So the drudgery of rural life. Second, she said, in the city, and this question talk about freedom, and both the second two answer to do with freedom. They're all answers about freedom. She said, in the city, if my husband's older brother comes, I can offer him a cup of tea without having to cover my face. In the village, I'll get a bad name if I do that. And the third reason she gave was that in the city, if I don't feel like cooking some evenings, I can go to a restaurant. Now, these are real life aspirations. And that's what we're up against. Dealing with climate change, with the environmental crisis. So, this is far from, the planetary perspective will take a long time to percolate. Like there have been huge floods in Bangladesh last few days. And the only talk has been about whether or not India conspiratorially caused this flood. A Bangladeshi meteorologist said, this is not political. It just rained too much. The skies opened up and it just rained too much. Nobody wanted to listen to him. It wasn't interesting enough. But the story about whether India caused it as a conspiracy was much more exactly. So this is the gap between how we think politically. And I still think that politics is still too much about the global. And it hasn't reached out to question the relationship with non-human. And in some ways people have in some places. And that's where we have a lot to learn, but we have to scale them up, our lessons, from indigenous people and other kinds of lifestyle. Particularly now that we know that almost 80% of the biodiversity hotspots are actually where indigenous people live. So they must have done something right. And we need to know more about what it was that they did right. Thank you.
So Dipesh, we can see the large contribution, your huge contribution to history. Yeah, the latest, yes, the climate parallax. And the first one is provincializing Europe, and I guess that all people interested in post-colonial studies and so on and so forth know this book. And maybe if you agree, we would like to open this door about post-colonial and this kind of issue. Please, Rahel.
Thank you. And let me also thank you for being here and for giving us the possibility to have a conversation with you. I've also been thinking a lot through your work and with your work, so it's a very, very, I'm very happy to be here. So maybe following on what you were saying before regarding this kind of difference of context between post-colonial thinking and decolonial thinking, and also linked to what you just said now about the relationships with the non-human. I wanted to ask you a little bit about your relationship with decolonial scholars and decolonial thinking, and what maybe inspired you from your conversations with decolonial scholars and also indigenous climate science. And I'm asking this because it would seem that some of the propositions that decolonial thinkers are making about relational politics, about our inherent relationship with the non-human, so this kind of questioning of the fundamental separation that we are making between the human and the non-human, that might actually be part of a solution, or let's say, as you were saying before, maybe we need different directions of solutions. One might be some technologies that you mentioned, but maybe actually there's another direction that could also be really fruitful, and this is the direction that decolonial thinkers have worked on a lot. So I was wondering whether any of this, or how this has influenced maybe your thoughts also afterwards, after having published, and maybe to some reactions that people have had to your book. And maybe if we could ask it in a bit of a kind of creative way, if you had to kind of build a research program building bridges between your thinking and decolonial thinking, what might that look like?
Thank you. Yes, I mean sometimes, So what happens is that, see, my intellectual politics is one of making alliances, not making enemies. But there are scholars whose intellectual politics is far more polemical in polemos meaning war. I mean, some polemical scholars want to make war. So if you, somebody whose work I admire, but Catherine Yusuf's book about the Anthropocene, it says either 1 billion Anthropocenes, that is 1 billion black people or whatever, or none. So, and I'm not an either-or person in my thinking. I'm more like an this and that person. Right? And so, in a Venn diagram, I'm more about the overlapping sets than the sets that don't intersect at all. So, if somebody says we need to go beyond, get back to what the world was like before 1492, I would be delighted if one could do that. But I think we live in a real world where forces more powerful than I am are also changing the world according to their desires. I mean, this top 1,000 people or their companies and things, faster than I could even cope with it. So when you ask solutions, I think there are solutions in principle, but you're negotiating them in a changing context, because the context is being changed. So, for instance, it's entirely possible that this question of what do we have to learn from indigenous people may have to be thought in a world where there's more carbon capture going on, there's more geoengineering going on, and the force of that question will be of a different kind. You might need to rejig it, ask it in a different way. But let me say, so since the book, so the third chapter of the new book is actually about the relationship between post-colonial and decolonial. So there, let me at least share with you one part of the argument. And the post-colonial thinker, Walter Mignolo is a very good friend of mine, and we have actually, when I was working on provincializing Europe and he was working on other books, we had a discussion group that used to meet from time to time, Latin Americanists and us from South Asia. But the person who has influenced me more in recent times is the Brazilian anthropologist Eduardo Viveiros de Castro, who sees himself on the decolonial side. And there's great things to be learned. I'll quickly say things where he has made me rethink many of my positions. But one of the interesting facts about the origins of de Castro's work, about multinaturalism, so where he says Western people think there's one nature and multiculture. If you look at Amerindians, you'll find that even nature is multi, right? Is to notice that he was in Paris as a student during May 68, when all the Deleuzian revolution in Parisian thought was happening. So if you follow his references to capitalism and schizophrenia and to the Thousand Pledges, you find a fascinating terrain of intellectual work being done, which is that one of the chapters in the Thousand Pledges, where Deleuze is discussing anthropology of Latin America and to some degree Africa, done by mainly French anthropologists, but also others. So in a way, the French anthropological processing of what they have learned from the kind of lives they were studying, coming today. I mean, Descola would be a kind of later point in this. That Deleuze is studying in light of Pierre Clastres' anarchist book called Society Against State, published in 1967, right? So there's an uptake of 40s, 50s anthropology through the tradition of anarchist thought in French thinking coming from the revolution. So you think of Rancière and all these people coming out of that very influential book called Society Against the State, being now rejigged by Deleuze to create the figure of the nomad, the nomadic agent, to pit that nomadic form of existence against a political existence that creates the state. Right? So this whole question of not a central control of relay mechanism, but the rhizome, that society is connected through grassroots-like relationships. Or the point he makes in one of the chapters where he says, the fact about moiety in the anthropological reading, about tribal groups, is that the moiety separates people but never the earth. They don't draw boundaries like this. And this has a huge influence on young Eduardo, right? And he kind of contributes back to this problem, saying, from his own understanding, so he takes this back. So my argument is that we are all entangled. European thought is learning via European anthropologists of indigenous forms of thinking. That is being processed in a revolutionary Paris, where a certain strand of anarchism wins out, whether you look at Deleuze or whether you look at Foucault. there's an anti-state. Foucault says state is not important, the disciplinary powers. And that is then picked up by a young anthropologist from Brazil, who then takes it back and comes up with a brilliant formulation, which I've learned so much from, where he says, we've studied the tribe Siemens, I mentioned the name, where he says, they think of jaguars killing humans and drinking their blood as the same as humans going to a pub and drinking beer. Or some other drink, not beer perhaps in their case. So the argument is that the indigenous people of his description have a capacity not to fix the human form in a particular form, to see the form as exchangeable. Mm-hmm. So you see, so think of it this way. I mean, this is how I've recently written about it in Bengali, in my mother tongue. That, what do we do? I mean, there's a Platonic idealism that actually works both in the commodity market and in the realm of aesthetics, where you kind of think that the perfect figure of the human is the proper form of the human, right? Like you pay for a perfect glass. In perfect glass, if the manufacturing process produces a defect, at least in Australia, I could go and argue, will you reduce the price? This is defective. So you're actually paying for the perfect form without asking where form comes from. But if you think of the human as vertebrate, if you think of the human as mammals, you begin to see different forms. You begin to see there are forms we share. Or even if you think of the individual human from the fetus stage through life, then instead of looking at the fetus, the young child, as kind of moving towards the perfect form in youth and then being in decline, you can actually think of the form itself being in formation. And this comes out very, very interestingly. When I was thinking through that, I discovered that Bachelard's book on poetics of space has an extremely interesting discussion of an essay by Paul Valéry, which I've only read in English, on seashells. Mm-hmm. And Valéry speaks of a very deep human predicament. Because you see, the seashell, that shell, takes the form because it's exuded by the creature as it grows. It's not a shell that the creature finds outside in a perfect form. So the form is always in formation. And Valéry recognizes that. He says, the trouble we humans have is that even when we know that the shell takes its form as the creature grows, so the form is always in formation, that is not how I draw it. Mm-hmm. When I draw the shell, I draw the perfect cell. And that is a profoundly human problem. And that is kind of made use of, I think, both in commodity aesthetics, so where you expect the glass to be a perfect glass, and in aesthetics, but not necessarily commodity aesthetics. Now, clearly, artists have debated this question, philosophers have debated this question, Bachelard did, but I think when I think of my friend Eduardo Viveiros de Castro saying that the jaguar drinking blood is the same as humans drinking an alcoholic drink.
Dipesh, I don't know very well the jaguars, but I know a little bit the humans, and maybe we have one key question which is important to address for humans. Sure. It's social justice. I don't know if jaguars had social justice, and maybe we could open this next door, because maybe about the topic of social justice, about the issue of social justice, maybe we can touch something, I would say, really human. Of course, I don't want to dig the big divide between a human and non-human, but what about social justice from philosophy to politics?
So
maybe?
Do you want me to answer this question?
But I'm sure that Rahel would like to add something. Yeah, please, Dipesh, elaborate a little bit about the relations between human justice and the planet issues.
I'm happy to.
Yeah,
so,
please.
On the question of justice, first of all, I completely accept Amartya Sen's argument in his book called The Idea of Justice, where he argues that one should not have a transcendental sense of justice. In other words, one should be pragmatic. So just because I cannot do you full justice does not mean that I should not do you half justice, right? So the first pragmatic principle is be as just as you can. And I think that's very important. Some people use the fact that they can't be fully just to do no justice at all. You know? So he argues against it. And taking on from that, I would say be as just also to animals, also to mountains, also to rivers, as much as you can. So the mountain example I bring from India, where the Chinese and Indian military preparations, and some from Pakistan, has made this mountain into the most militarized mountain in the world. And that has a bad impact ecologically. With the glaciers are receding, this mountain actually services with its water 50% of the world's population, the Himalayas. So there is a question of justice. Secondly, I also want to say that something I think about humans is that you know, one of the pleasures of thinking about history is, of course, that you see ironies. It's really that what Eliot said in The Wasteland, that between the promise and the performance, there falls the shadow, right? And I think humans have evolved to be an animal with a very keen sense of justice. I mean, we are among the apes, we probably have the most keen sense of justice, but humans are also spectacularly poor at giving it. Sometimes you see a group that has been very unjustly treated in history treating another group unjustly. I mean, we can all think of examples like that. But it doesn't mean that justice is first of all, I think justice is not just a human project. In many animals, you sense a sense of justice. Even if you play with a dog, at least you sense. So first of all, so if you think there are animals into whose existence you have imaginative access, you know, where you think my dog is happy or my cat is depressed, these kind of creatures call for justice because imaginatively you can see them. So mountains and rivers and these things call for justice because we destroy them. And we need them in self-interest. But at the same time, let me say something which is risky, which I have not said to anybody yet because I fear getting killed for saying it, at least intellectually. So, you know, we are humans. We belong to the animals and the trees that depend on the oxygen in the air. And we are very grateful that phytoplanktons and these things produce oxygen, maintain this level. But this oxygen in the air was put into the air by a revolution, mainly induced by algae and bacteria, 2.5 billion years ago, which is called the Great Oxidation Event. And oxygen, there was much more nitrogen in the atmosphere. And oxygen is actually a poisonous gas for many creatures. So when that happened, a lot of nitrogen-fixing bacteria died to such an extent that Earth system scientists call that episode the oxygen holocaust. So then I go back and ask myself, was it unjust? Was that oxidation event, was it unjust to the microbes that lost their lives or were driven deeply underground into thermal vents and elsewhere? If that was unjust, then our life is based on a huge act of injustice. Or I think maybe the question of justice doesn't apply to the microbial world, but we have to make sure in our own interest that we don't bring microbes closer to us that we don't want. And that means preserving forests. That means preserving biodiversity, preserving animal habitat, right? So I kind of think if you think through from the planetary perspective, place us in the history of life, then justice, and this is what I am genuinely scared of saying, but I'm saying it. If you want to object to it, I'll be very interested in hearing your objections because I love to find myself to be wrong, and particularly on a topic that's so uncomfortable. What I'm saying is not comfortable for myself. But I sometimes wonder whether in the history of life, in the longer perspective, justice is not a second-order question, and survival of life is the first-order question. But even putting that question to one side, I wonder whether one can be just in human sense to the majority forms of life, which are microbial. But I can easily imagine being just to forms of life that we see, we deal with, where the question of justice from the moment of animal liberation in many ways has been thought about. So Martha Nussbaum, my colleague, has just produced a question of justice to animals. But again, see how she imagines animals. She says, just as the point of economic justice is to allow humans to fulfill their capabilities, we should allow animals to fulfill their capabilities. So a tiger's hunting instincts should not be smothered by what we do to the tiger. Except she doesn't like violence, so in one lecture she says tigers should be given rubber balls and things to take their violence out on, right? But from my position, I'm saying you can't be just to all forms of life. But you know that all forms of life matter. So you should be careful about letting them be.
Yes.
Right? So I make a distinction between letting be and being just. And going back to Amartya Sen, I say, be just when you can. Be just when the justice question is totally visible to you. Be just when the injustice is completely visible as injustice. You have to be just. But the injustice may not always be a way to address biodiversity. So
yeah, but this point is really important because the principle, we could understand the principle, but the issues are really huge because the spectrum of biodiversity is so large, so huge.
And there are species you don't even know exist.
Yeah.
Right? So you can't have anticipatory justice. Just as you sometimes do wrong because you don't know these species exist. Sometimes it's through crisis you find out. So that's what I'm saying, that when the question of justice is visible, there's no other option than being just, even if you are imperfectly just.
Valérie, what do you think about this position? So Valérie is an economist and she tried to integrate biodiversity in her thinking. Valérie.
No, thank you. I want to join my colleagues, and I'm really happy to be here and to have a chance to have this conversation. And of course, I'm really interested in the additions to your book, because the argument you were developing in your book was very much focused on climate change and biodiversity, which is also a facet of the global or planetary, ecological crisis, is actually very different. It's a result of highly complex and context-dependent interactions, interconnected processes between human and non-human beings, as you told us. And it's very difficult to describe biodiversity in general categories, in context-independent words, and to subsume, generally speaking, the forms of biodiversity into global categories. So you mentioned the visibility of some parts of life and the invisibility as a criterion, perhaps to deal or to select the elements that should be accounted for in a way, but practically, in practice, what does it imply for your work, or what would it imply to look at biodiversity rather than as climate change, given the differences that you've just mentioned?
So I'll let me speak in principle, since I'm not a very practical person. So in principle, it means, I often say this to students and colleagues, that if you think of human technology and the history of this, and there's no question now with AI and everything, there's been a revolutionary, we've been through some kind of technological revolution with the digital age compared to, and then we had the electronic age starting from the Second World War, then we had the electrical age in the interwar period and the age of cement and all that, and then you go back and you have the mechanical technologies, the cotton being, and the railways and the connectivity technologies. And one of the things that technologies have done is to make seasons and weather marginal. to the concerns of human productivity. And central to this is the story of air conditioning, refrigeration. And I often said, look, I always thought mango was a summer fruit. Now I eat it all the year round thanks to cold storage. And without human capability of being able to control both low and very high temperatures, you would not be able to preserve medicines, many of our medicines. You would not be able to transport them, as we did during the pandemic. And so there would be more children's mortality. You know, the flourishing would be in serious crisis. And you would not be able to produce a lot of the hybrid materials that we deal with. I mean, maybe the covers of these seats from aeroplanes, all that often require being able to control temperature. Yeah. So while you acknowledge that there's been a revolution in technology, I want to say two things. A, this technology has made us forget the fact that the seasons and weather are a life and death question for humans. So if you go back to peasant societies, and even with indigenous, I sometimes have to remind people that we were all indigenous. I mean, that's where we started. Our parents, our ancestors were indigenous. And peasants. And I've been recently reading a book called Remembering Peasants by a British historian, Patrick Joyce. It's clear that whether the sun shines or it rains too much matters, whether it will be a drought or whether the produce will be lost. We have the technology. I mean, there's a beautiful passage that Pierre Charbonnet cites from Joseph Proudhon, the philosopher, where Proudhon writes a very colorful passage saying, oh, we've got railways, we can travel in any weather. This theme that technology is gone, what it does mean is that even though the technology is very developed, its overall impact on questions of biodiversity is like that of a sledgehammer. It doesn't make any distinctions. So, for instance, Václav Smil's How the World Really Works, he argues from his data that if we did not use artificial fertilizers, 40% of the world's population will go without food. He says that. Again, I'm not, I can't really judge, but he's a dependable scholar. But pesticides cause insecticides. Making banana available to the entire global population means privileging one particular variety of banana over others. So basically, you're actually producing the banana crop at risk by not fostering biodiversity. And the only way, I think we live in a world, we've benefited from science of technology, but our technology, not so much the science, our technologies have to be more fine-tuned to ecological consideration. So sometimes in my library, I was giving a talk to librarians, I say, when there's a fungus in the book, you have to get rid of the fungus, but before you kill the fungus, find out what other services it's providing. It's an enemy for you. But is it helping some other living creature? Is it helping some other process? And in that case, can you develop a technology where you disable an aspect of the fungus? That is good for you, an aspect disabling which is good for you. But you let it do other things that it want to do, because we might even need this thing that in this particular context is an enemy. And I love books, and I think the history of books and book production goes up. The history of books is humans producing a lot of food for white ants and termites and fungi, and then killing them when they come to eat the food that we're producing for them. So there's a kind of peculiar cruelty in that. But I was saying, okay, I love books. I don't want the books to be destroyed by white ants or termites. But before you just simply kill them with poison in this sledgehammer fashion, you don't think. So what I'm speaking about is this need for technologists, engineers to be more aware of the ecological services that different forms of life provide, to the degree that we have knowledge of them.
So, dear friends, I have to see the time, and now maybe we can come back on the scene, but I think it's time just to ask you if you have a question, and maybe to start with the question of the public. See, I see your hand, and the mic will and okay, Niklas, you're here. So we have the chance to have Niklas here, and Niklas is a professor of earth science, and the discussion between history and earth science is really central, pivotal in your work. And maybe, Niklas, please ask the first question.
So thank you. It's on. Yeah. So I got the recommendation to read your book 3 years ago, almost 3 years ago, by Ola Söderström. He was on the Academic Planning Commission, and we talked about a position related to environmental crisis in the past, in the geological past, and he was sort of arguing that there would be an interest from the humanities, and that's why your book came out. And then I sort of read it as sort of bedtime reading over Christmas that time. So not at all as a scholar, and there were many things I liked. One thing, of course, was this discussion about timescales, the long geological, biological timescales, and that in the past you've been ignoring the change of, let's say, Earth system processes, and now these two systems, let's say the global, you call it, and the Earth systems, they are coupled, and history and so on has to change. So I thought that was interesting, but we were, Ola was talking about things that were sticking, and the thing that was sticking for me was actually a discussion you had about the timescales. You talked about the timescales about geological processes, the timescales of evolution. And you were also talking about history of the future at some point, I think. So something came up to me, and as I said, it was bedtime readings. It's not an academic question, it's more of a personal question, but I got some comfort in an idea that I got by reading the book, and it was basically saying that, because I think also you're talking about how many billion years the Earth is probably going to be able to maintain life. So if you think about the fact that in a million years, Homo sapiens is gone, pretty much for sure. I saw you were arguing that point. I was seeing a discussion you had for a book festival. You were talking with a colleague, and you were saying that in 1 million years, we are gone. If you then go on 100 million years, whatever residue of biodiversity we have will have developed into a new, rich biodiversity. Geological processes have removed a lot of the surface aspect of our planet, and there's still going to be a few billion or many billion years of life on Earth. And for me, I sort of got comfort in thinking about that. And you, as a historian and a humanist, let's say, can you sort of get comfort? Because that was actually my question to myself when I read it. Does the author, you then, actually find some comfort or some hope in such an idea about a future really far away where actually life prosper?
Thank you.
Maybe a short answer, if I
so
can.
This is why, thank you. So this is one reason why there's a chapter in the book called Anthropocene Time. And but one reason why I moved away from talking so much about the Anthropocene to talking about the planetary was that if the Anthropocene is a geological epoch and not an era, even as an epoch, it could last 10,000 years, it could last 20,000 years. Sometimes epochs can be 10 million years. And I was not sure, first of all, that I can adjudicate that in terms of being a humanist historian, nor sure that it's a good name for Earth history, but may not be a good periodizing device for human history. So that's why, again, I was actually trying to be a historian of the present, in the sense that Francesco talked about it. And I was thinking, whatever may be the future, what this crisis has revealed, thanks to reading Earth system scientists and atmospheric chemists and people involved in this, it's revealed for us historians like myself, the importance of thinking also on this scale. Because, so again, I'll repeat myself, but I cite a sentence from Wittgenstein's in the book, where Wittgenstein says, when we look at a building, we ask, how old is it? why don't we ask this question of a mountain? And you know, we were in Chile a couple of years ago, and even here, you suddenly think, do people going to work really every day think about how old the Alps are? You may not, because as a historian, my answer to Wittgenstein's question would be that even if a mountain is young, as the Himalayas are, in terms of how old mountains can be, they still they take up a humongously bigger amount of time that we take up as individuals, right? So for us, it's like a constant background. And the kind of separation of natural history from human history was on that assumption that what we call nature is like a background. And we can do whatever we want to do to it. It doesn't change. In fact, when the news broke of climate change, my Indian upper middle class friend said, the earth is too big. You don't need to worry about it. The earth will take care of it. And clearly we've proven that the relationship, this dimensional relationship between earth and humans, is a relational concept. If humans develop the capacity technologically to affect the earth, then the earth shrinks relatively in size because we get affected. And then what you accepted as background has become foreground. So my argument in the book is really to say, whether you think about policy, whether you think about activism, we are living through times where it's important for all human beings to have both the global framework in mind, which speaks of empire inequalities, and this larger story. And so I was, as a historian, I was trying to update Hannah Arendt's book to say that the human condition has changed and we need to recognize it.
Donc, pour des personnes qui veulent se poser des questions en français, c'est possible. Rahel se fera un plaisir de les traduire. Donc, n'hésitez pas. Voilà, je vous en prie.
Merci. Good evening. You said few words about indigenous people during the conversation. I would like to know how do you feel with the fact that since the beginning of this ecological or even climate crisis, those who since the beginning have a deeper understanding of those issues and have the knowledge to protect our planet don't have their voices heard or not even considered. Thank you.
Again, please.
Those who have the knowledge?
Not considered to protect our planet, don't have a voice, are not considered.
No, I mean
thank you.
Yeah, thank you. And I mean, that is totally true. And this is a problem of democracy, of global politics. This is the task. And this is where I think that part of decolonial literature, which actually is constantly pointing to the history of indigenous management of biodiversity hotspots, much better than we have. They are giving us lessons that we should all learn, think about. We may need to scale them up because you're doing it for a larger number of people. But I agree with you that they don't have a voice because the reality of the world is, as I said, there are people far more powerful than even a puny university professor like myself. So in a way, you have to conduct that politics in a world which is also being shaped by people more powerful than we are. So it's not a static world. And as I say, I ask this question about biodiversity. Tomorrow there might be carbon capture going on a large scale. Tomorrow there might be geoengineering, and you have to rethink that question. But at the same time, see, because I'm not thinking of a war model of politics. So I'm not thinking about us versus them, because I think even the worst, quote unquote, capitalist is a human being. They are going to have grandchildren who are going to inherit an uninhabitable world. So that knowledge should inform everybody's thinking. How to protect biodiversity is not a question of being kind to indigenous people. It's a question of having enlightened self-interest. It's in our own interest that we need to think about these things. So I think that argument has to be won in a world where there are many powerful voices trying to suppress that argument. I mean, but that task is cut out.
Maybe we can go after on this really important question, but I think we do have a question of you, Jacques Dubochet, our dear friend's Nobel Prize of Chemistry.
Yes, thank you very much. You told us very important things. I took them very strongly on me. And yesterday, all the Swiss people here received home the document in order to prepare a vote that we are going to give in 3 weeks' time. Exactly on that, deciding to give to our government the responsibility for defending biodiversity. Just that. So, thank you very much.
So no comments about Swiss democracy, Dipesh?
It should be a model for the rest of the world. It should be a model for the rest of the world. Actually, I'm more stable. I think this goes back to discussion I was having with Ola. I mean, what you have here. Democracy needs to be devolved and deepened for those voices to come up. I mean, from my experience of India, this doesn't happen. It really, people have to be empowered institutionally to be able to articulate, ask this question, and governments need to devolve. I mean, that's why this is an unfinished task of the struggle for democracy, which I think is critical to dealing with the problem of climate change democratically.
Other question, une autre question? Oui, là-haut, please.
Yes, hello. I'm sorry I didn't read your book, but thank you for your book. I would do the comment that I'm a beekeeper and I'm active in Renan as in the politics. So I see the side of biodiversity for my bees that are declining, and I can see the decisions that are taken in the politics. And I'm fighting every time I can to teach the politics to make good decisions, starting to choose the right trees. Because the basics is, as you said, the animals, the barrier of the animals, we are getting more and more nearer to the animals, and there's less and less nature everywhere because there are more and more buildings everywhere. So it is important that the quality of what we plant and what we have everywhere it is very important. And even I tried and I did explain how the bees and the butterflies and the birds need to have the food, this is the basics. They need to have the food during the whole year. And if we plant only, you can see, you go outside on the road and you have only one kind of tree. And for example, a bee needs to have 3 kilometers around her during the whole year to have the food. And this is not possible because you have only platan or I don't know, and it doesn't give any food for the animals. This is basic. So I hope if you continue writing the books, perhaps we can speak after. I can send you some information, basic information, so the people can learn about how they can plant and give good nature in the cities around us. So already starting, the little animals can get the food. Thank you.
Thank you for the question, and I'll be even more grateful if you send me the material that you just promised. I would love to learn from it, because there's a ridiculous proposition in America to build robotic bees that will pollinate but not produce honey for us, and bees are in decline in America, and basically, if you kill these insects, you kill pollination, and your food won't grow. What you eat won't grow. It's just. That's why I think see, when you listen to these arguments, now, so just let me respond by saying where I see the problem And I think there's a genuine problem, which is, so when I read Bill Gates' book, How to Avert a Climate Disaster, he strikes me as a very smart person. He strikes me as a knowledgeable person. And if you made this argument to him, I don't think he would miss the argument. He would see it. But then I think, why does he end the book by saying, we have to build a New York-type city every year for the next 40 years to house human beings? Even when he might know that we're running out of sand with which to build. And then I realized that there's a compact, an unstated compact between him and the middle classes of India, China, and aspiring, my peasant woman in Himachal Pradesh who said, I want my daughter to grow up in a city. There is a compact because you see, the reason why human numbers went from 1.6 billion to 6 billion in the 20th century and then to 8. And why human average lifespan increased, it was about 30 before the 18th century. Before the Second World War, they said 45 to 50. And now see how it's grown. I mean, even in India, we talk about 70s, people dying in their 70s. Here, my pension fund people say, oh, prepare to be living into your mid-90s. I don't want, well, I want to for my wife's sake, but I don't really want to be that old. But all this has been made possible because with the help of energy, access to more energy, we were able to reduce, and things like antibiotics, we were able to reduce child mortality. We were able to reduce maternal mortality. And the population, you know, when I say average lifespan was 30, it doesn't mean that everybody died at 30. It means that some people went on to become 50 or 60. And in many ways, as we were able to support more humans living for longer, human life itself became a value. See, if you go back to the older religions, it's not necessarily the span of human life or that's the value. Sometimes death was, how you died was the question. In the Franciscans, in Mother Teresa's case, what was a good Christian death was the question. In Hinduism, what was a good Hindu death was the question. But we have produced a society where we live longer. Our families, therefore, can be smaller because you don't fear that your children will die. But we also have developed a cultural alienation from dying. Whereas if you go back to peasant societies, dying was more common. My grandfather had, between two wives, had 15 kids. Half of them died. My grandmother lived until I was in high school, and I remember whether she was demented or not, she used to talk about being visited by her dead children. So I grew up with somebody else with a very different relationship to what death and dying. I will never have that relationship. But that losing that relationship was the price one paid for actually living long, thanks to these technologies. But these technologies are actually now imperiling our lives collectively. And for the first time, the lifespan of white Americans has taken a beating. For the first time in many years. It's dropped a little bit. So in some ways, going forward, these problems are real, but we also have to acknowledge what we owe as just human beings to this technology and why it's so impossible, not just for Bill Gates, but for the Indian middle classes to imagine having our freedoms, but not letting the freedoms be so dependent on access to cheap and plentiful energy. See, we have become a style of life, a form of life that depends on access to a lot of energy. That's why we say, let's go to renewables, let's have windmills, because we don't want to have less energy. Amartya Sen argues in an article he published in New York or somewhere else, during the climate crisis, he said, look, the need is for more energy, not less. And I find it fascinating as a historian because when we became independent in 1947, Gandhi was a believer in freedom, but not a believer in industrialization. So he thought you could have freedom of speech, freedom of movement, without industrialization. Nehru was a believer in protecting people's lives, getting rid of famines, dams, high-yielding variety of food, people agreed with him. But so for him, the models of freedom got locked into the same model everywhere, where actually it's forms of life that are dependent on consumption. Now, if you read Bill Gates' book, it's not because he's a capitalist and a bad person. He begins by acknowledging all that. But what he's wedded to is what most people are wedded to, and what we are protecting, these people, my economist friends and technological friends, are trying to protect, is the good life we have. And they want to give it to more people, share it. If there was not a climate crisis, we would have a different kind of argument against them, probably an anti-capitalist argument, probably a distributional logic argument. But I think what is very hard for humans to give up is the reduction of child mortality, the reduction of marital mortality, which we owe to public health, to modern medicine. And that's the kind of dilemma we face. And that's why what you're saying has to be kept in mind. That's why I feel the role of the bee. We have to think about the bees and what we want for ourselves together. And do the thinking together. And I think the more we create intellectual positions where we point to somebody and say, you are the problem, I am the solution. If I did that, then I would be denying my own investment of desires, my own desires, in having this argument, in having this discussion, in living a long life, being there for people who might need me, and therefore being dependent on medicine. I'm not saying that's a good thing. I'm not saying flying is a good thing, but we all do it. And so that's why I think I have difficulties with intellectual positions that say the West is the problem and the East is the solution. I look at my own society, India. I look at Chinese society, they're not the solution. We're all participating in the error because the error has been productive for at least 150 years. Initially for Europeans and now for other middle classes. But we're also becoming more and more aware of why this is erroneous. And therefore we have to go forward finding how to reconfigure these freedoms, which we also value as human beings. And that means being undogmatic. No formula will give us a solution. That's why as a historian I'm simply saying, understand the long-term problem, understand the short-term problem. Understand the short-term success of our technologies, and understand the long-term damage they've done. And I'll give you an example of a great, well-known person who doesn't get it. And that's Steve Pinker, the Harvard psychologist. Read his Enlightenment Now book. He will give you the same figures for exponential growth and then say, oh yeah, there's a climate problem, but we can fix it. He doesn't understand the depth of the problem, the depth of our dilemma. So that's why what I was trying to do in the book was to take a measure of the dilemma. And that's why I was not rushing into writing a book about what should we do. So the reverence is not a prescription, the discussion of reverence. It's really asking this question, how did we come to lose the reverence that indigenous people had, peasants had? How did we lose it? And I think technology is a large part of the answer.
So Dipesh Chakrabarty, I think that the topic of dilemma will be the last of the open discussion tonight because the time is out. So thank you very much. And again, congratulations for the prize, the essay prize of this year for the Charles Veillon Foundation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, and thank you to all, everybody. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.